Good morning. It's nice to see many familiar faces. So I'm just going to say that I think the fact that this is a workshop as opposed to a presentation means we shouldn't do 3 PowerPoints and talk this way, even though spatially we're being pushed to pretend that we are still a panel as opposed to a workshop. So I'm going to sort of take you through a bunch of things about Delhi and really just raise more questions than do anything else, and feel free to stop me at any point in the middle and just open this up in a conversational space, because otherwise we'll be here for a very long time and I don't have that much to say. Okay, that's a lie. I can talk with you guys. But so what I wanted to do is to do 2 things, and and I think in the spirit of productive dissent, let me also say that I sometimes struggle very much with the international covenants and the space of law and definitions of eviction, particularly and I think citizenship is a very interesting frame, because at its core, citizenship is about a membership in a political community, right? It gives you rights and it gives you duties. And the question is, what's the relevant political community, right? Typically, the default answer post-World War II is the nation, because you hold a passport at the nation, right? Human rights will push you from the nation up to some kind of belonging of a shared humanity, though it's unclear what the political community of that humanity actually is, right? And particularly these questions. So in India, for example, our courts have the discretion of using international law and using agreements we have signed as legal Indian law and drawing them in. But they do sometimes and don't sometimes, right? And so it's an interesting question. They are not bound by it as they are bound by our constitution. So it's an interesting place to think about how do you actually exercise citizenship in international law, and how do you bring that law down. But the city, is also a political community of some kind, right? And I think the idea of urban citizenship is questioning and saying, is belonging to the city and using the city as the place where you claim your rights and exercise your duties as opposed to the nation, does it create a new regime of the distribution of resources, rights, and responsibilities? I mean, that's really the question we're asking, right? And so if there is a notion, so let me suggest James Holston, an anthropologist who works in Brazil, who defined urban citizenship and said, your primary belonging is to the city. So you say, I am a Paulista. I am from Sao Paulo. You don't say I am a Brazilian. And I brought some of this up in when I was talking a couple of days ago about how elite citizens of Delhi will say, we are citizens of Delhi, right? But the poor will say, we are citizens of India. And I think that claim is a very interesting one, right? Because what does it mean to be a citizen of Delhi? Right? And remember, the word citizen actually comes from the idea of the city-state, right? It comes from notions of city-states that turn into nations. So in a sense, this is a return to that original idea. But Holston is describing a very different moment. I'm describing an elite urban citizenship. Right? He was describing what he called an insurgent citizenship, where people on the peripheries, right, Bulek or Haganah, are claiming an access to the city, saying, we built this. Okay? We settled this side of the ring road. And because we built it, our citizenship is a claim that comes from work. Right? It's a claim that says, because I built it, I must have a sense of ownership in it. You did not build it for me. So it's a turn away from turning to the state. Right? It's actually telling the state, recognize that I have built this city. Right? And it's literally the work of labor, of the filling in of sand, of the brick, of the house, is the claim to the city. So it leads to a very different imagination of what citizenship is. But how legal structures recognize and move. The only country in the world that I know that has a legal, formal urban citizenship is China. Because in China, where you are born determines whether you are a rural or urban citizen. So it is the only formal regime of urban citizenship. So you talk about a visa to come to Cairo, you need a visa to go to Beijing. Right? Because you're meant to entitle benefits from the state. If there's a birth registration system called a hukou, right? And if you have a rural hukou and you move to Beijing, you cannot access state facilities in health and education because you are not an urban resident. So there are actual differences in birth. But other than that, the question, that's a formalized citizenship. How do we think about the substantive experience of citizenship at the city level? And that's, I think, a provocation to us, right? And evictions are one way to get to that kind of provocation. So let me leave you a little bit of context. And so in one of the settlements that I worked in for many years, which was by the river Yamuna in the north, right, there was a friend of mine who I knew for many years, and he once looked at me, and there was the rumor that the settlement was to be evicted, right, was to be demolished. And this is in the very classic dictionary definition. A bulldozer will come and break the house, right? So there's international law, and then there's common sense. Like, basically someone comes and breaks your house, it was demolished, you were evicted. And he said, they do this every few years. We'll demolish you, it's illegal, you're informal, but the election is coming. Right? And in this sentence, you can capture 20 years of urban theory on informal settlements. Right? Patronage, clientelism, vote banks, the poor as citizen, the reason you think I'll invade, but he can't evict me. The state can't be seen to evict poor people. It will tarnish his development. It's bad PR, basically. Right? And in bad PR in democracy means you lose an election. Like, it's a little more than a marketing thing. And he lived here. Right? And I show you this picture also to make a sense that we have this idea that has lasted for too long, that informal settlements are marginal, that they are small. And the word informal makes you think this, right? It's chaotic, it's fragile, it's marginalized, it's temporary, right? And so it's this is a settlement that on a Google map, that, on the top is the river, and the color of the river is actually that black. It's not a Google image, this thing. You guys should be very happy about the fact that your river looks like water, as opposed to ours. But this is 3.5 kilometers, right? 3.5 kilometers, 35,000 households, 300,000 people. Right? So informal settlement. Now the question here is, it's not that the state did not notice that 300,000 people had built a large settlement, right? So this whole idea of informality, of Asif Bayat's notion of quiet encroachment, the idea that you sort of sneakily come, it's nonsense. I mean, these are settlements in our cities. The scale, we were driving on the ring road out to Haganah yesterday. It's like 7 cities in one, endlessly, never stopping, in buildings in which no one lives. I'm completely mystified by Cairo, I have to tell you. But the fact is, when Ashok had an imagination of a history of the way the city was settled, the idea was you come in, right, you occupy, you just survive long enough to get a cycle of election or two, and if you survive long enough, you will enter into the city. That is how the city is settled. The city is not planned, and our cities are not planned and built, at least, right? So, you sit there, and in planning school, you get taught this, right? You plan, then you do services, then you build a building, and then you occupy. That's what elite people do. None of us move into a half-finished house. Right? No one in this room has moved into a half-finished house. You wait until the paint is done and the water flows. The way we settle is first you occupy, then incrementally you build a little bit of money, another wall. You get one service at a time, so the services come incrementally. At the very end, do you think about re-entering the plan? It's the exact opposite cycle of settlement. Right? And the question for us, in terms of thinking about how we think about housing in our cities, is partly to recognize that our cycle of inhabitation and the production is entirely the reverse of what textbook planning is meant to be. And the fact about that question is, Ashok was saying, I've done this for 23 years. I have occupied, built, got services. There's no way, right? There's no way. And so, in a sense, this housing is a claim to citizenship. What he's saying is, I lived here. This was marshland. No ground could stand. We filled in the sand. We filled in the big. We were workers in the city. We run this city. We are citizens, right? So it's not a claim to formal law. It's a claim to a notion of belonging and work in the city. It's a very powerful claim, particularly in democratic contexts. The problem is that he was wrong, right? And in 2005, over 3 months in an operation that involved representatives of the army, and in India the army, it doesn't, I suppose it exists, but it doesn't sort of show up in our life, right? So when the army turns out something has happened that you don't quite understand, that the entire settlement was destroyed, right? And it's in the mix of how you take that and make that you have a real moment where the question of citizenship and housing becomes no longer academic, but very, very real. At a very real fight. So, you don't have this in Cairo. Not at this scale, not in this way. But if we are to connect the two cities, one of the things to think about is to think about how a situation like this comes, right? And I can tell you from the few days that I've spent in your city is that eventually you will struggle with this in Cairo. Right? And you will do it sooner rather than later, especially depending on how the next few years go. So how do we understand this? Right? This is a longer pattern. So if you look at the red, what you're seeing is the red is the number of what we call JJ clusters, and I'll explain what that it is, but just imagine it as temporary vulnerable illegal housing, right? And you see the number of them rising, and then a big drop in the red between 73 and 81, right? So it's the first big cycle of evictions that happen. And then again a rise where the state again allows the poor to build illegally, and then again a big drop between 2002 and 2010. And those two parallel drops are what are the subject of my work. What explains these? Now, the interesting part is that there are 2 years in Indian history that where we lost our democracy, where we had the declaration of martial law. They're called the emergency between 1975 and 1977. Now, that drop, that first precipitous red line drop, happened in the emergency. It happened when the constitutional safeguards were suspended. It happened at a time where you imagined evictions would be possible because you had a dictatorial government that wasn't accountable. The second drop happened in functioning democracy. So the question is, how did functional democracy, you asked me a question yesterday, right? This is my question. How in a functional democracy do you manage to get evictions of this scale and not suffer the old concept? Why was Ashok wrong? Where did this cycle break? And that's, I think, what we're trying to grapple with. But I think before that, let me provoke us, because we've been using this word a lot over the last couple of days, and I want to sort of both suggest, I want to suggest we set it aside, but that's more provocative. And I want to at least say, let's be specific in what we mean, right? So informality, so I'm going to talk about it in 3 ways. An informality in use, which means, are you using this land the way you are meant to use it? Is it zoned agricultural and have you built a shopping mall on it? That's an informality of use, right? So Bullock is an informality not because the villager who sold the land to a developer in 1975 did not have the right to sell it to him. He did. That transaction is formal, right? So that's the second category I want to keep, that when you have this notion of buying land, when someone pulls out an agreement, a contract, and says, well, I legitimately bought this land, it's not bought in bad faith, they're right? They have a formal transaction for land. But that farmer in the agricultural land that Bullock is meant to be on the plan had no right to sell land to an urban development. He could have sold it to another farmer for agricultural use, right? But the transaction is formal. The transaction is valid. This is separate from occupying public land and paying a slumlord for your right to remain on a plot. But that slumlord has absolutely no right to sell you that land. It's not his to sell, right? Which is a very different type of illegality. So what I want to say is, when I use informality for use, I'm referring to the use of the land in relationship to zoning and master plans. When I say informality or in transaction, I'm referring to whether you have a written formal, did you pay by check every month to buy that house in Hagana? What is the nature of your transaction? And the last, when I use the word illegality, because I don't understand what an informal property right is. So when you use the word illegality, my question is, the title to your house, will the state recognize it as a legal property right? Can you get a bank loan on it? Can you get a mortgage? Can you register it in a land registry? Is it recognized as legal title or not? Right? And I think this makes a huge difference. And I'm going to end the presentation suggesting a different kind of frame, which is a framework not of informality or illegality, but of legitimacy. And arguing that our concern should be about legitimate housing, as opposed to legal or illegal, formal or informal. And I'll say more about what I mean by that in a little bit. So given that context, the question is, why do we care? What does it matter if something is informal or not? Why is Bullock different from Tahrir? Like, what do you actually lose? And I think it's important to be specific about this, because you lose different kinds of things depending on the kind of settlement that you are. So the first question I think we must ask is, do you have the right to remain? So do you actually face a threat of eviction? Right? Do you literally are unable to stay in the place where you are? And this is the threat of eviction. Now, the threat of eviction alone is enough. Because if you think you could be evicted, think about if you lived in a house and you thought you could be evicted any time. What do? You don't invest, you don't build, you don't protect. So the threat, the possibility of eviction is enough to stop the development of a community. You don't actually have to evict them. The reality is a further shock to the system, but the cycle of deprivation begins at the threat, right? So, and to do this, and here I'll disagree with Joseph. I mean, I think India has signed the covenant international law. We do not have a right to housing. I think we be very clear about it. Our constitution has no words that say right to housing. South Africa has a right to housing in the constitution. We have a right to information. We have a right to education. Right? We do not have a right to housing. And we had a massive moment in the 90s where movements tried to insert a constitutional amendment to the right to housing, and we lost. Right? And the framework of a lot of these evictions have to be read in the absence to that right. The second question is, oh sorry, that's bad animation. Do services and infrastructure depend on informality? So in the Indian context, municipalities and service providers legally cannot provide services if you are not on the plan. So there is an absolute, so you care because you legally cannot get those services, right? Now this has changed in India, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's no longer true. So service providers since 2006 have been told, it is not your job to see if something is legal or illegal. You're a water company, put water connections, right? Now that's transformed the game, and in ways that are both good and bad. The last question is, do you have, and this goes back to the story of the electricity meter in Cairo, right? You can't get a mobile phone without the connection. So how do you exist as a citizen? So the one thing is, I'm a citizen because I'm here and I look Egyptian. But when you go to the things, you will have to produce a formal documentation of your citizenship. You need to exist on paper. Very often spatial illegality is connected to the inability to exist on paper. You don't have an address. You don't have a bill. You don't have a meter. Right? So how then do you exist as a citizen? So this distinction between proof of so in India, service programs and social security programs are constantly fighting this question of can you prove who you are? And can you prove where you live? And for our regimes of spatial illegality, both of those are equivalent problems, right? Why else do you care? You care because when you live in situations that are unregulated, in many ways, one is not recognizing what you're doing with your house. So for example, in India, in informal settlements, all commercial use is prohibited. But every residence in an informal settlement is also an office. It's also a storage unit. It's also a workplace. Right? But you can't have that recognition without recognition in law. And the challenge that I want to also put out to us is, I obviously do not know how to animate a slide. The challenge also I want to leave to us is, we speak of, the word informal was first used for economic informality. Right? And so we have begun to speak in urban theory about spatial informality as if it's utterly disconnected from informal work. And I think that's a big mistake. Right? So I'll give you an example. In Dharvi, Bombay's biggest, Asia's biggest slum, etc., 1,300 inspectors of the police force live. Right? Of the police force of the city of Bombay. How do we understand their vulnerability? They are formal employees of the state in the arm of the state responsible for enforcement and eviction. Right? They cannot be vulnerable the same way a home-based worker or a street vendor living next to them is. Right? So one of the things we also have to think about is, how do we relate economic and spatial illegality? And how are they connected to each other? And I'm going to say that one of the failures in the De Soto paradigm had also been that the assumption that legal title would change this access to finance and capital actually ignored the fact that the employment and income of the people with legal title did not change with the legality of their title. Right? So when we look at employment, income, and security, it gives you a very different picture of how to think about illegality. All right. So keeping that in mind, the context that I wanted to give you is, and I hope that Yahya will do this for Cairo in some sense, so that we can have a real comparative here. This is our plan. Right? So what I want you to notice on this is one thing. These are the various types of ways in which people settle in India, in Delhi. Right? So planned colonies, people who lived in things called planned colonies, in 2000 were only 24% of the population. Right? What does that tell you? It means that all of these other rows are somehow not planned. Right? This is the reality of the way cities settle. So how are they not planned? They're not planned in multiple different kinds of ways. And what's really interesting about this is that it matters, the specific nature of the illegality matters. Because you are not vulnerable the same way. So Bulek, for us, is what we call an unauthorized colony. Okay? So no, they will never ever call themselves an informal settlement. They are an unauthorized colony. Because in the Indian context, a colony is what we call a neighborhood. It's an affluent neighborhood, right? So this is partly also aspirational signaling. It's saying, don't call me an informal settlement. I'm an unauthorized colony. And what they're saying is, there is nothing informal about what I am. I paid for this land. I bought this land. I have documented proof that I bought this land. You're right, it's agricultural land. I shouldn't have the right to have an urban residence on it. But if tomorrow I break down my building and grow sugarcane, I'm legal. Right? So now the question here is, it's a different, so it is the informality of use, right? But formal transaction without legal title. Because the titles to people who live in these colonies, they can't go to a bank and they cannot go to a registry. the government will not recognize their titles. Right? This is different. Now, what is colloquially called the slum is actually what we call the JJ cluster. The plan calls the JJ cluster. Now, note the immediate politics of naming. Right? This is a colony. This is a cluster. Why is it a cluster? Because a cluster is temporary. It's a sprinkling of unordered. It's not a neighborhood, right? It's just a cluster of shacks. Now, I showed you the picture of what that JJ cluster looks like. 35,000 households with neighborhoods and street signs. But it will be called a cluster so that you think of it as something temporary and unorganized, right? So the naming here is this is why informal settlement in informal area is something that I keep struggling with, right? Because how you name and talk about these things teaches you how to value them, right? So when you think of the JJ cluster is actually this is people who, they paid someone to settle, but that transaction was not formal. And that person did not have a right to sell that land, right? It's not a village or rural land that they own. It's mostly government land or a private land. So this is squatting. Okay? This is occupation. So when you look at the difference here, now what happens is that every once in a while, what the government does is to regulate, it's called regularization. So they will take unauthorized colonies and they will simply change the plan use, right? So Bulek goes from agricultural to urban mixed use. Done. Finished. Khalas. You're legal. Now that's the point. The point here is if your informality is in use but not in title, all it takes is the change of one planning zone and the entire settlement is legal because the ownership is not contested. This is critical. You cannot do that with the cluster. You would have to transfer ownership of publicly owned land to those families. Now this distinction is key. They're not both informal settlements. They're completely different kinds of informality. Right? So what happens? An unauthorized colony becomes a regularized unauthorized colony. Now note that it doesn't become a planned colony. At this point, it's on the plan, it's legal, it's recognized, but it has to be reminded that it began in illegality. These are very important discursive practices. When you get evicted as a JJ cluster, some part of you will get resettled at a separate location, so you enter legality and you become a resettlement colony. Okay? So what is this? It's two pathways of beginning from illegality and becoming legal 15, 20 years down the line. But my point is the rich do it just as much as the poor. Right? That the idea of occupation and post facto legalization is the way both the elite and the poor settle the city. So the question we're looking at is not there is a legality. It's that different illegalities have different consequences. Right? And only one of these will get demolished, which is this. There is no recorded instance of an unauthorized colony in India being demolished. Not one in Delhi. Okay? And this is a differentiated regimes of citizenship. My illegality does not have the same consequence as your illegality. My illegality will be regularization, your illegality will be demolition. It is the ability, James Holson had a really brilliant line. He said citizenship is the legal distribution of inequality. It is the right to treat citizens unequally. This is what that system is, right? So what I want to leave you with this, and this table is a dissertation in itself, because we also have, you'll notice, both urban villages and rural villages, right, inside our city, and there's a long story about where they come from. So, but what I wanted to leave you with this was exactly this, on these different natures of illegality. So, what do you see? This is our 1962, Delhi has 3 master plans. And the yellow area indicates the urban area, right? So this is what we were discussing yesterday about if Giza is agricultural, where does the urban end? Does it end at that train track? So the yellow line is my end. That's the urban area. Everything outside it is rural. Now you'll notice the blue dots represent the 1,600 unauthorized colonies. These are our bullets, like all lined up. And you see where they are. They're all right at the edge of the plan boundary in rural areas just outside the plan. Okay? So so I'm constantly told that Delhi is unplanned. This is not unplanned. Right? So the city is not an outcome of, the city is not as it is planned, but it is an outcome of planning. Right? You make a planned border, you may not put things where they should be, but they will be right next to it. Right? So you've created the pattern. So what do you do with this? Right? The new master plan in 2007 expands the urban area out. Right? It catches up with the built environment of the city. And in pink, right, it regularizes or legalizes and brings. So basically what happened to Bulek in Delhi is that it became legal. Right? So it became legal simply by the change of saying, the reason you're illegal is because the ground under your feet doesn't have a plan. Here's a plan. You are now yellow. You are now in the zone. You are now legalized. right? Now what's fascinating is, if you look here, this is a map of existing JJ clusters in Delhi, right? And what's fascinating about it here is, you notice the unauthorized colonies built right outside the plan. The poor settled right inside the plan. Okay? Now, it's very interesting. So you've got two responses to the city. If you can afford it, you buy a piece of agricultural land outside. If you can't afford it, you settle right in the center. Okay? Because that's where the work is. So you see these two very different spatial regimes of organizing. And what evictions are doing is that, so I don't know if you can see the colors, but half of those are red and half of those are blue, and the reds are the eviction. So what are you doing? You're hollowing out the presence of the poor in the city and sending them to the edges and basically moving out these 30 years of negotiated settlement. Right? And where, and I want to finish very quickly, and just to continue where so I've been looking for a long time to understand how this got done. So looking at case law from the High Court that ordered evictions, one of the things that I wanted to point out is not all of this gets fought out in textual law. This gets fought out in political imagination of who is entitled to what. This is a political game. It's not about planners' technicalities. We pretend that planning is this rational, scientific, modern exercise. It's simply not. You look back here into this agreement, it's fascinating. So the yellow is urban. The gray is what the plan calls urbanizable area. Right? Now, urbanizable area in planning is meant to be where the city will expand. Every bit of that area is built. Right? So what's the game we're playing? We'll recognize half of you, but not the other half. Okay? So you see the pink and the blue together? So three of us are colonies. You got legalized, I didn't get legalized. So what are you doing? You're keeping control over that uncertainty. Right? You're keeping your system of patronage. You are pretending that there is urbanizable area when you know that your plan is catching up. It's not a technical, rational exercise. It's politics. It's absolutely a political determination what you do or what you don't have to do. Right? And so when we think about that, we have to understand what the current political economic moment allows you to do. This goes back to my question of 2 days ago. Whose claims get empathy? Whose claims are recognized? And why? Right? So what happened in the case law is that you in court, when people went and said, hello, we are poor citizens of India, you cannot demolish our homes because the word socialist is in our constitution. So, India's constitution, we are formally a sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic, and we inserted the word socialist through a constitutional amendment. So it was very thought about, right? And they went and said, the word socialist is in the constitution. How the hell are you destroying our homes, right? And their argument was, and what's interesting is that what I've been looking at is the way the courts did this dance is one to determine and say, we must rule in the public interest. We must protect the citizens, right? But the citizens shifted from being the poor to these new elite urban residents, right? The citizenship, so when the city became a space for citizenship, the people who claimed it in India were not the poor, it was the rich. Right? So Holston's argument about Sao Paulo is that the poor redefined the constitution and claimed the city. In India, the exact opposite happened. The first stab at urban citizenship and belonging was done by the elite. They're the ones who said, we are Delhiites. We are the citizens of the city. We built it. We pay taxes. We have rights. And this is where the competing claims of rights rose. So the courts were able to say, we are ruling for citizens. And they repeatedly said this. The citizens have a right to good life, to dignified life. And the poor were written out of this story of citizenship in a very interesting way. And one of the ways they were doing is the word that emerged in the 90s in the court cases is they were never called the poor. They were never called citizens. In court, the poor only existed as encroachers. Right? And the use of the word encroacher meant that the way you thought about the poor were not as people with need for housing, but as people who had illegally occupied public land. So they entered in as criminal agents, right? And I point to this again because the words are really powerful, not just in a court of law, right? I am a poor citizen, I have need. I am an encroacher who illegally trespassed on public land. Right? If you think of someone as an encroacher, it becomes possible to say you are not worthy of rights. You are not morally worthy of protection. If you were the poor, so the court actually at one point, one of the judges said, we must fulfill our role to the poor, but not at this cost. Right? So suddenly you have progressive realization says, not in this way, not to this. So to make the poor morally undeserving, and in the history of all the world, from American welfare regime debates to social housing debates, everywhere the debate on worthy versus unworthy in terms of social security is an endless debate, right? The moral criminalizing of the poor is a long history. But this is a particular history because it's being retold from a social development history as a thing of spatial illegality. So the act is encroachment and the person is an encroacher. So it's a personalization of illegality. And they look at us and say, how can you ask us to reward encroachment? How can you ask us to give rights to encroachers? How can you ask us to allow the rule of law to be broken? The rule of law was also broken by the rich. But they never got called encroachers on agricultural land. They were simply called citizens of Delhi. Right? So these regimes of differentiation are really important because the court is ruling for the majority. It's just a new urban majority that has claimed the city in that sense. Right? And the last two things I'll say is, I think to understand this, we have to understand the shifting, partly the shifting representations of how we understand poverty in India today. So this is an ad for the State Bank of India. Right? The State Bank of India is one of the world's largest public banks. And it's like emblematic of the national development story. Right? So they had an ad, and the tagline of this campaign is banker to every Indian. Okay? So the State Bank is a public bank, which means the street vendor selling you the golgappas, that's a snack that we love. And now I'm hungry. Right? So the street vendor, and then the middle class guy who has an appropriately sized belly to show his contentment, right? So this is the development trajectory. You go from left to right, right? So it's in Indian culture, if you are wealthy and thin, you are suspicious, right? So there's so he's appropriately sized, right? And what they're saying is, look, we're his bank and his bank, so we bridge the class divide, right? We are the banker to every Indian. So, and this is, in a sense, India's developmental story. We will take everyone along. You may be rich and we may be poor, but we will take everyone along. Just around the evictions, the State Bank had a new ad campaign. Right? And I think it's very important to read these visual cues very seriously, right? Because this is what the judges see in the newspaper when they go to court in the morning. This is where they learn how to think about and evaluate their fellow citizens. So what's happening? These are the famous dhobi ghats in Bombay. So dhobis are it's laundry, it's clothes laundry, right? And so again, the spatial and economic informality here is very key, right? So the dhobi ghats are entirely informal, but they have no vulnerability to eviction. You can't touch them, right? Because they have a certain cultural. It's like the fishing villages in who's I talking about? There's someone. Right? So what you see here, right? So here's one. He's beating and he's doing the clothes. He's called Raghu. That's very interesting. Only one name. Right? It's only one name. Why? Because it's an infantilization. Right? Because you can call the poor by their first name. I can be like Joe, right? Not Mr. Joseph Sesha, Joe. You know, and it's a diminutive name. It's what we call Daknam. It's the name you get called in your house, as opposed to your formal name, right? It's your nickname, or whatever that is. So by using that, it's a very interesting kind of push of saying, this is just Raghu. Like he's being made small. And it says ex-pickpocket. Right? Why is he an ex-pickpocket? Because the State Bank has a debit card, so no one carries cash anymore, and he can't steal, so he has to work. What's the logic? Right? Banker to every Indian becomes the poor are criminals until proven otherwise, and here he is in his rightful place doing labor and work because he can no longer steal. Right? Now, the ad, it's amazing. So the ad was pulled because of complaints to the National Press Council. And so I was like, amazing. Like, response, movement, justice. You know what the complaint was? This will give incentive to poor people to turn to crime. The complaint was that it will put ideas that pickpocketing is a good life. It was incredible. The complaint was not about this representation. It was the other sort of end. But they did pull this ad, and they did go back. So I don't want to sort of have a slow decline to endless this thing. Right? I mean, these are very contested terrains. Like, these images don't go uncontested. But the production of them is very important for us to recognize, because this is the playground in which regimes of citizenship are determined. It's not textual law. Right? It's in the everyday practice of citizenship that I think it's important. So the question then to think about is, impoverishment is what I spoke about a couple of days ago. I want to leave us with this idea of legitimacy, right? And I'm defining legitimacy as the enjoyment of either a de facto or de jure. And de jure means literally from the jure, right? Written in law. It says in law that you are legal. Versus de facto, which is, it doesn't say written anywhere, but I'm not going to get evicted, right? Now, so de facto is when you have a security of tenure that doesn't come from textual, legal, written property rights. And I think ways to get at that are very powerful. Like, why is it that Ashok, in that settlement that I showed you, which had existed for 27 years on the same side, had no legal de jure security of tenure, but absolutely believed that they were secure? right? That sense. Now, to me, or why do all unauthorized colonies never fear eviction, right? Even without title. So it's that idea of what makes one legitimate, as opposed to, and legitimacy can come from law, but it can also come outside law. It could be that you are a religious settlement and the Muslim Brotherhood will not evict you. Right? It could be that, it could be a social claim. It could be that you live in a place where no one else wants. Right? So there are multiple ways to get to legitimacy that don't necessarily need to go through legality. And I think it's a more useful term for us, because it's asking these settlements that survived outside the law, how did they survive? How did they become legitimate? And what are the multiple ways that they used? Formal, social, political, cultural, aesthetic. How? Right? How do they negotiate that out? And let's us think about actual negotiations rather than legal categories. Right? So if we keep saying that cities of the South don't look like their plans, cities of the South don't look like their textual laws, then let's start from the practices instead of from the text. And they will come up with something completely different. Hi, thanks.
Thanks, Gautam. You've illustrated very well the remote nature of the theory of citizenship, of human rights, and the overriding principles of non-discrimination, self-determination, and rule of law theoretically form a package. But in the differentiation of security of tenure, of different categories of tenure, we see exactly how far we are from that theory.